Okay, is that agreed?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair. I just want to really speak about one aspect of the bill, and that's the part that will enable ratification of the intergovernmental agreement to the single resolution mechanism in order to make it operable. Obviously, as we know, this is part of a suite of measures introduced at European level in order to bring about banking union. And as the story or the fairy tale unwinds, and we had to listen to it earlier, we're expected to believe that the great shining knights of the political establishment across Europe are going to come in and valiantly battle with the big bad wolf of the banking sector and defend Little Red Riding Hood. That essentially, if the banks get into trouble again, the public aren't going to be bankrupted because of it. And my only answer to that really is, yeah, right. I mean, seriously, the idea that we're discussing this has a certain irony in the context that this is the week when the figures came out that revealed across Europe the Irish public suffered a per-head reduction in wealth far in excess of any of our European counterparts, €18,000 per head. Again, the ordinary people of Spain and of Greece were similarly decimated at the same time as wealth in the Netherlands and in Germany rocketed over that same period. And given that we know of the substantial rise in wealth of Ireland's wealthiest citizens, that makes the overall loss even doubly hard to take, because it means the ordinary citizens even paid a price beyond that. And the idea that if this was truly a solution to that bank bailout problem, well then obviously it would be great, but clearly this isn't that whatsoever. I think it's appropriate to look at the bailouts that took place across the Eurozone since 2008. €1.7 trillion was the cost of it. The Irish public's cost, €64 billion. We spent €2.3 billion this year alone servicing the debts to the banks, paid for by the unrelenting cuts in public services, in social welfare, housing, jobs, decent pay and conditions for workers, a very painful and vivid memory that the poorest and weakest of our citizens have had to endure. And really what's taken place across Europe is a structural reorganisation of society, or in some instances a political, if you like, counter-revolution, that many of the gains in social welfare, post-war reforms that were delivered have been rolled back on in the name of finance capital. And I think there are a lot of people who don't want to remember the banking bailout. Obviously it's a painful memory for Fianna Fáil, but the government too told us before the election, not one red cent, Labour's way or Frankfurt's way, and so on. But obviously history as it's developed has been radically different. And while on the face of it, a system to bring about an orderly resolution of the banks seems like a great idea, we have to be very clear. What's on the table here is not that, and it has little promise of delivering an end to the bailouts by the public. The idea with the single resolution fund is only €55 billion, which is, let's be clear, chicken feed in the world of banking. According to even sort of back of the envelope calculations by one of the Financial Times economists, he reckoned that the banks could be holding bad assets to the tune of about €2.6 trillion. So €55 billion is a pittance in that context. It's absolutely inevitable that the public will be called upon again to bail out the banks. The fund is only going to come in 8 years' time. If a bank gets into trouble before then, or if there's a need for a bailout beyond the €55 billion provided, the only backstop is the ESM. And we all know what that means, because we only have to look at what happened when the Spanish government went to the ESM to recapitalise the banks in 2012. What was the price that the Spanish people had to pay? The signing up to a massive policy conditionality, including demands to increase the cost effectiveness of their healthcare sector, pension reforms, labour market reforms, reforms of public transport, massive privatisations and so on. A very similar issue demanded on the population of Greece. Yeah, we'll give you some of this money, but in return we want you to decimate your public services, we want you to unleash privatisation, and we want you to sacrifice everything to the altar of neoliberalism. And I think we have to say that what we're looking at then really is that a banking union with a resolution mechanism that isn't near enough, and that's obvious even at the start. And to be honest, it's likely that as the negotiations go further in terms of banking union over the next period, that the banking lobby are the ones who are going to dictate the pace, because we've seen that's what they've done throughout the process. In the meantime, there's going to be no end to the creation of speculative financial instruments which have caused so much damage in the first place. And I think, according to two analyses from Finance Watch, and I agree with them, a bank resolution system that doesn't contain, and this doesn't, ambitious preventative measures, such as dealing with the too big to fail problem, the too interconnected to fail problem, and obviously the too complex to resolve problem, it's just not credible without that. And this has not been in any way addressed by the provisions that are before us. So what we will have actually is a European banking sector that continues to remain as interconnected as it ever was and dominated by the mega banks, which are not going to be of any benefit to the citizens of Europe and certainly not to the citizens of Ireland. As Finance Watch says, if banks are not reformed, that they pose less of a systemic risk, they will simply block the mechanisms designed to resolve them. And that's what we've had from this process. The banks have blocked the mechanisms designed to resolve the problems, and they will continue to do so as long as this government and its counterparts in Europe continues to enslave itself to the ideas of neoliberalism. And Minister, you touted the slogan or whatever during your budget speech that you were going to deliver an end to boom and bust politics and all this, but you know what? You're not going to do that, because it's an inherent part of neoliberalism. It cannot be done, and the idea of imposing an unrelenting sacrifice on the citizens of Europe is just not going to be tolerated. So you can be guaranteed that boom and bust, and indeed a struggle to resolve that situation, is going to be part of our history, because the citizens of Europe certainly cannot afford to shoulder the burden of the banks any longer.